They're searching for that one trick that's going to make the Iranian regime collapse. For a couple of weeks, it was bomb police checkpoints. The people will rise up. That didn't work. Then it was the blockade. Iran is going to run out of places to put its oil. They were wrong about that. Generally speaking, people on Polymarket overestimate the likelihood of unlikely events.
Hi, I'm Shira.
And I'm Jordan.
And this is Mispriced by Quotient. Trade the narrative at app.quotient.social. So today we're focused on, will the Iranian regime fall before 2027? Q thinks the market is mispriced, mostly because the IRGC has a lot of incentives to preserve the Islamic Republic's formal structure. But really, the thing to keep in mind here that we'll try to get into as we're covering this is the difference between what is a facto military takeover and a formal constitutional break. So Polymarket has this at 13.5%, almost 14%. Q has it at 6%. So there's an 8-point spread here, but aligned in terms of it being no. But before we really get into the narrative and start to break all of this down, it's really important to focus on the resolution criteria. So in order for the market here to resolve to yes, the Islamic Republic's current ruling regime needs to be overthrown, collapsed, or otherwise cease to govern by December 31st, 2026. And the criteria really requires that those core structures have been dissolved or incapacitated or kind of completely replaced by a totally different governing system, and that the regime itself has lost de facto power over a majority of Iran's population. So there's a pretty big threshold for this to go to yes. And in terms of some things that some might think count, but actually don't count. So any sort of like routine political event, like an election or a reform or a leadership succession, that doesn't count. If there was an internal coup or if there's some sort of shift in power, but it still preserves the core structure of the Islamic Republic, that doesn't count. If there is some sort of loss of territory or some sort of challenge by a group of rebels, unless the republic no longer administers the majority of the population inside Iran, it won't count. And even a de facto kind of military takeover that keeps the existing constitutional framework itself, that won't count. So, okay, so like what Q already sees is that Iran's military and the IRGC, they're running the country, not the clerics. And the supreme leader who hasn't appeared in public, the military speaks for him, that's already taking place. Like there's already like a lot of like AI videos that are coming out trying to kind of persuade the public that he's all good, but TBD on what that actually looks like. And ultimately, the IRGC has no reason to formally take over. They already have power, and the clerics are already being blamed for the economy.
So to like run that back, what Q is saying is that what's happening is that the military is taking greater power and that the supreme leader, who before was unquestionably the most powerful person in Iran, is now being sidelined. But despite that, that doesn't mean that a replacement of Iran's constitutional governing structures or wholesale collapse of the Iranian government is imminent. It means that the regime is adapting within the constitution and institutions, but Q doesn't think that those constitutional structures are going to disappear or be replaced or collapse.
The market's at 14%, so we're aligned directionally. But why do you still think that Q is more bullish, I guess, in its no stance than the market? Is there something else that you think the market believes or is confused about to have that spread make sense to you?
So I'm never quite sure exactly how to answer the question of like why do people in the market believe what they believe or do what they do. But to kind of elaborate on Q's case, first of all, if the government was going to collapse, you would expect to have seen like signs of that being imminent or more likely when the regime was under more pressure. So like during the massive bombing campaign, the regime bounced back. The president is active, just today posted that he had a meeting with the Supreme Leader for 2.5 hours a couple days ago. So the Supreme Leader, despite what people are saying about him, is still out there conferring with people. Mohsen Rezai, who's a very prominent member of the Expediency Council, is making public statements with his views about the negotiations. So representatives of all of these different constitutional structures with Iran are actively governing the country after the military onslaught. So like they've gotten through the rough period. What would really threaten the regime, besides the US military, is their economy, right? There's some chatter about whether the blockade might be removed as a first step towards a ceasefire. So the US is already considering giving up the key leverage it would have to put pressure on the regime without military force. And even if the blockade isn't removed, the US intelligence establishment is assessing that Iran can survive a naval blockade for 3 to 4 months, which is at stark contrast to the thinking when the blockade was initially put into place, which was that Iran is going to run out of places to put its oil and it's going to have to shut down its oil wells. So I think that people might underestimate the ability of Iran to adapt to challenges. It's a very resilient country that has adapted to all sorts of challenges and external pressures for decades. So, yeah, we're just not seeing the indicators that the regime is about to collapse. And if anything, the kind of leverage that could push that is starting to be removed.
Are there any other incentives for the regime to preserve that constitutional framework?
Or why would they change it, right? The stated Trump rationale for the military action as it relates to regime change was that there's certain bad apples within the government and they wanted to like remove those bad apples and then get a better deal. But like Trump and Rubio and Hegseth don't care about like the Guardian Council and Shia jurisprudence. They just want Iran to stop shooting missiles at Israel and to get rid of their nuclear program. Changing the nature of the Iranian regime would be a huge endeavor, and no one really has an incentive to do that.
I felt like at the beginning of this conflict, the US was kind of supporting the interests of the people. But it just feels like that's not really part of the picture right now in terms of how that's being presented. Would the public have any sway or potential in forcing some sort of formal collapse? Is Q kind of underweighting this
I
aspect?
don't want to completely speak for the Iranian public, but the people of Iran don't want the Iranian government to collapse. Like they might want the supreme leader to be removed. They may want like personal freedoms. They want like the economy to improve, but they don't want like the country to collapse.
Yeah.
People don't want to live in a civil war. The Iranian government can do things that people want without changing its character. One thing that people want is for the economy to get better. You don't need to change your constitutional system of government to accomplish that. Some people want more openness and liberalization within society. You can do that without changing your constitutional form of government. Look at MBS, like Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia decided that women could drive, right? Like, but they didn't change their ruling system. I think that they want change, and the state can provide that change through its existing structures.
So is this an issue in terms of how the market and the resolution criteria is drafted versus what you're getting at in terms of wanting the change, but the market is actually talking about kind of like a complete collapse?
So, like the discourse amongst the national security Iran intelligentsia, you had one group of people who were like, before the war, this is a bad idea. You're not going to bomb the Iranians into making significant like concessions. Their repressive apparatus is really strong, so there's not going to be a big popular uprising. The Kurds aren't going to help us. We just like betrayed them twice. That's a bad idea, and it would make Iranians scared of a civil war. And like the other side was like, well, the regime is like more, fragile than it looks. And like if we just put some pressure on them for a couple months, like the people will rise up. And like those people have just like been wrong. But there's very like powerful people and organizations that advance a kind of like optimistic view of what would happen if we did the strikes and did the blockade, and they were wrong. Like FDD, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, it's this think tank that promotes like a fairly like hawkish line on Iran, and the people from FDE were kind of like searching for like that one trick that's going to like make the Iranian regime collapse. There's influential people who were just wrong. And some traders see those people on Twitter or people reposting those talking points and like make that trade. It's like trader psychology is
Yeah.
a whole other thing. But I mean, generally speaking, people on Polymarket overestimate the likelihood of unlikely. Like trader psychology is
Yeah.
a whole other thing. But I mean, generally speaking, people on Polymarket overestimate the likelihood of unlikely events.
In the forecast, it lists out what would need to happen in order for the forecast to change or for Q to think differently. And it names kind of like two scenarios. One is kind of like lower ranking security forces having some sort of mutiny in Tehran over unpaid wages. And then the other is that there would be some sort of senior cleric publicly denouncing the regimes like Shadow Regency. Is there one of those that feels more likely to you?
No one would care if some cleric denounced the IRGC. The clerics are their very convenient scapegoat. And I guess with the defections of low level people, why hasn't it happened yet? Like when they were under bombardment for weeks, there was no reports of defections. There was no reports of defections after Reza Pahlavi issued his call to the people to rise up. And he claimed that he had tens of thousands of security forces sign on to some documents stating that they were with the monarchist, and nothing happened. So when is it going to happen? And again, like the driver for this could be, in theory, if the blockade was continued and the Iranian government wasn't able to pay people's salaries, but that leverage is being removed. And then even if you're an unpaid 22-year-old besieged member and you decide to disregard all of your years of training about how to kill protesters when ordered, you belong to the group of people that went around killing protesters, and your life's opportunities all kind of hinge on the continued existence of the regime, right? It's like if you work at Palantir, after you leave Palantir, a lot of your professional opportunities are going to be through the Palantir network. So even if you're not getting paid, you have to be like, chaos is going to give me a better outcome. And it's like really important to understand that in the Iranian economy, a lot of companies started by people associated with the IRGC. So yeah,
I mean, imagine what the world would look like if everybody was just like 1% less selfish. Because that
it,
outlook that you feels sad to me.
it's also an assumption that removing the regime would result in like a better life for anyone. Because in my view, the most likely outcome is that the state becomes really weak and there's a bunch of chaos and there's mass migration from Iran. And what happened last time happens, like the group that's the most aggressive seizes power in the power vacuum. Traditionally, like empirically, the movements for greater democratic and economic liberalization and autocracies that work are nonviolent. They take place over a longer period of time.
So to summarize the combo here, it's a no that the Iranian regime will fall before the end of the year. And a lot of it is just because they have an institutional interest in preserving it. And it's like what do they have to gain by having the formal collapse?
Yeah, I mean, even on January 6th, people weren't like, we're going to get rid of the legislative branch. They were like, we think the election was stolen and we want to restore democracy. So even when people do dramatic things, there's still inertia towards justifying them through the existing structure of moral and legal justification.
So if you wanted to read more about this narrative and our analysis, you can check out our app at app.quotient.social, or you can follow us at Quotient HQ on X. And again, nothing here is financial advice. Always do your own research and have a great day.